Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. So today's topic, we're going to be covering the concept of converting fat into muscle. So this is going to be kind of nutrition based, but it kind of falls in the middle of nutrition and training. So what brought this to light was I was talking with a dietitian recently, and they had talked about wanting to get back in shape. And the dietitian said, quote, I want to turn some of this fat back into muscle. And I don't think that they knew that, I don't think that was a joke, because none of the context of the conversation was a joke. And whenever we kept talking, it seemed as if they thought that was a real thing. And it is absolutely not. So fat tissue and muscle tissue are completely different things. They have absolutely nothing to do with each other. So other than they're in our human body, but there's nothing about them that are the same. And so to hear it coming from a dietitian was a little bit scary. This dietitian does not have an exercise background in the sense of any kind of certifications. And so I would assume that they would, when giving advice to clients, they would be staying within just nutrition advice, and then probably giving them general exercise advices in staying active. But hopefully they weren't giving them actual training advice if their knowledge doesn't know that fat tissue and muscle tissue are different. So that's a little bit scary. So, and we often, I've heard people say this before about how, maybe an ex-football player or somebody who used to be an athlete, and they'll say, yeah, man, that guy just, he turned from solid muscle into just a big blob of fat once he retired. And it wasn't that his muscle turned into fat. And I've actually had people say, oh, I don't want to get too muscle bound because I know that just turns into fat when you get older. And it's oh my God, that level of lack of knowledge is hard to deal with. Especially when somebody says it so, with such conviction, and they couldn't be more wrong. So it's just, it gives you an opportunity for education. And I wish when I was younger and I was an idiot, somebody would have pointed it out to me and gave me some more education on this stuff. So so I try to, when appropriate, when the person seems like they would be interested in actually knowing the difference, I try to explain or educate when I can, if I know, a little something to help. And then likewise, I ask my clients anytime. I have a client who's a physical therapist, and I ask him all the time to tell me if he thinks something I might say or do or think is either wrong or he has a counterpoint to it. So I like whenever I get feedback from people in the sense of not it doesn't have to be questioning in an aggressive way, but they'll be hey, I heard you say this on a podcast. Would you mind explaining that more? Or, hey, I heard you say this, but I always thought it was that. And then you get into those discussions. And, sometimes it turns out I'm right, and it gives me a different perspective on how to explain it in the future, to where maybe there's less questions afterwards. Or sometimes, maybe in the way in which I'm trying to explain it to somebody, if I notice that I'm struggling to explain it, then that means I don't fully understand it myself. So therefore, it gives me an opportunity to go back and relearn things and kind of learn them in more detail so I can refine my knowledge. So as much as I would pick on the people at the beginning there of not knowing the difference between fat and muscle, I hope that I get exposed, and I hope I get a chance to learn the things that I think might be true that turn out to not be true. And just recently in a podcast about the trainer education podcast, let me see what number that was, we talked about the idea of how just information changes over time. So I think it was, it was podcast number 252, titled Be Open-Minded, and how, sometimes the things you think today to be true are going to turn out to be false tomorrow. And I gave through the example of how fasted cardio turned out to be a huge mistake. Now that people have done it and learned more about it, whenever it first came out, that was supposed to be the saving grace of how to lose fat and maintain your muscle. And it turns out that was absolutely the stupidest way to try to maintain muscle. Running an unfueled machine. Yeah. So, but anyhow, so you have to be open-minded, and try to learn new things as much as you can. So, getting back to the concept of fat versus muscle, fat and muscle tissue are different things. They're completely different things. So they're made up of different molecules. They have different properties. They have different shapes, like involvements in the body. So it's like comparing apples to oranges, but not even that much. Like, at least apples and oranges are still fruit, but fat and muscle tissue work like comparing feathers in a Ferrari. So they're very, very, very different things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the process of how somebody kind of goes from being fat to more muscular. So how they would turn their fat into muscle, so to speak, or how why it happens that some people go from muscle to fat, like why their muscle quote unquote turns to fat. So that's not true. What you'll see is it's basically you're just either losing or building muscle while you're losing or building fat. And let's go through that a little bit, learn a little bit of the process of it, and that way we can better understand this phrasing of, turning fat into muscle or muscle into fat, and we can stop using that phrasing. So let's first look at the illusion of turning fat into muscle. So essentially it's getting lean enough to show muscle. So that would be like our thought is if, I used to mistakenly think this when I was younger, whenever I kind of did my first kind of quote unquote hashtag bulks, where you just eat everything under the sun, eating pizza and ice cream and burgers and saying, well, it's okay, I'm bulking. So no, you're just getting fat. So what ends up happening then is after the period of bulking, you would diet down. Maybe you want to diet down for the summer, get that bikini body, the beach body, and try to impress all the girls. And what ends up happening is you realize, holy shit, I was just a big fluffy puff ball of fat, and there wasn't as much muscle underneath there as I thought. So I've done a diet in the past where I've done several diets where I lost 50 pounds or more. And I remember one of the diets where I lost 50 pounds in 10 weeks. And I realized okay, I'm 50 pounds lighter on a scale, but I don't really look much better. So there wasn't really as much muscle to show as I thought there was. So too often people think there's this chiseled, muscled athlete, like a Greek god kind of body, underneath these layers of fat. So they go onto diets and traditional cardio stuff where they're walking or running or jogging, and they think, okay, well, I'm going to take off all the fat, and then all those beautiful muscles in that Greek god body is going to eventually show. The downside is that's absolutely 100% extremely, extremely, extremely often the case that there is absolutely no Greek body underneath there. So how those Greek people built those beautiful bodies was doing physical labor all the time and being physically active in sport and wrestling, doing physical resistance, so type activities. If we've just been sitting on our butt for the last 10 years getting fatter while we worked on a computer, there's no Greek god body under there. There's no muscle under there, okay? So what ends up happening is people will lose fat and they don't change much of their composition. They don't look much different. So they go from a big pear to a small pear. So they go from big to small, but they still look like a pear. There's no compositional change. There's no muscle lines popping out. There's no amazing definition. And when that's the case, it means that there's no muscle under there. So as they're putting in the efforts to lose fat with diet and activity, they need to also make sure that that correlates over to building muscle tissue. So we'll get more towards the end here of what type of activity people need to focus on. But that's often the case. And a good example I have of this is I've worked with tons of women over the years where they were bigger women, they had big butts. And, they're like, oh, I got to lose some fat and, get this butt in better shape. And they think as they lose fat, there's going to be this muscular bubble butt underneath there. And there's nothing. It's just pancake butt. So they go from a big butt to no butt. And the reason why is there was no muscle. So the idea of losing fat is that you have, underneath our bodies, we have bones and organs. Then you think you have layers of muscle. And then in between your muscle and your skin is just fat. So people think, well, if I lose the fat, the skin will tighten down to my muscles, and you'll be able to see these beautiful muscles. But there's no muscles. So they're bone and organs, fat and skin. So very little muscle. So overwhelmingly all the time, when I have bigger ladies who need to lose weight, they wonder why we do a lot of heavy glute work and why I still train their legs almost like a bodybuilder. And the reason why is because they need to have a butt to diet down too. So rather than having a big butt to no butt, we got to go from a big butt to some butt. And the thing that's going to give them some resemblance of a butt is actually glute muscle. So we have to build that muscle. So that's the big thing, is when people they want to go from fat to muscle, so they want to go from a fat body to a muscled body, it's not just losing fat. That's half the equation. The other half is you have to build some damn muscle. So you have to have some muscle to show. And that is not going to be there if you don't have a regular routine of resistance training. So unless you're like heavy and overweight, but you're super active and you lift weights all the time, okay, sure, you're going to have a muscle build underneath there. Okay? But if you don't have a regular routine of resistance training, when you diet down, there's not going to be much there. And I'll tell you right now, guys, listening to this, you are not as much muscle as you think you are. So if you're, 250 plus or 300 plus, and you're like, I'll diet down, I'll have this big barrel chest and these big 20-inch arms, horse shit. Absolutely not going to happen. You are going to have no chest, and you will have skinny arms, okay? Unless you get into the gym and build that tissue up. So you have to train like a bodybuilder, eat like a bodybuilder, in the process of trying to look like a bodybuilder. Isn't that amazing? So that's the idea. If we want to lose fat and turn our body into a muscular physique, you have to do both parts, okay? You have to diet and be active to lose the fat. And you have to be active through resistance training to make sure that you actually build the muscle that you want. Now, some people are going to say, how can I lose fat and build muscle at the same time? We're going to talk at the very end, but it comes down to having a correct balance of calories, protein, and meal timing, and then doing what's called caloric cycling. So you can 100% build muscle tissue as you lose body fat. Your diet just has to be set up correctly to where you have a small caloric surplus, or at least at caloric maintenance with extra protein following your workout. Depending on how much muscle you want to build and how much fat you have to lose, that window of a kind of a balanced diet with surplus protein can be different. So some people, you might have a 4-hour window, some people might make it an 8-hour window, some people might make a 12-hour window. So, but after your workouts, you want to have enough calories that your body has protein to spare. And where it's going to do with that extra protein is build muscle. Then at all other times, you want to be at a controlled caloric deficit with enough protein to maintain muscle, but there's no excess of calories of anything, so that way your body will pick away at body fat. So you absolutely 100% can do that. And we've talked about in past podcasts about like having a peak body composition. So it can be done. It does mean that you have to pay really close attention to what you're eating, because you have to know whether you're in a deficit, a maintenance, or a surplus. And for some people, I mean, as sensitive as 200 calories in each of those ranges, like you can be minus 200 at the number or plus 200, and that can make or break the day. So that's important to think through, that it can be done, but you have to put a lot of effort to do it, okay? And that's normal of life. If I want special things and I want, really awesome results of something, I have to put in awesome work. I don't get to put in pathetic work to get awesome results. So that's the idea. If you want to turn fat to muscle, quote unquote, okay, recognize first of all that doesn't happen. You're just simply going to lose fat as you try to build muscle. So that'll give you the appearance of getting leaner but having muscle. That's the goal. Now, if we want to, what happens, not that we would want to go from muscle to fat, but what happens when it seems that people turn from a muscular body to a fatty body? And the reason why is, at one point in time, they did activities in resistance training that promoted muscle tissue. Now they're not doing that. They've stopped it or they've lessened it, but there's something about what was maintaining muscle for them that has decreased. However, what didn't decrease was their nutrition. So if you think of like a football player, let's just say, for example, that they had a 4-hour practice every day. So they had to eat enough to be fueled in recovery for a 4-hour practice. Now, if they're no longer doing the practice, but they're still eating all that food, that's what happens, is the muscle goes down because they're no longer doing things to maintain muscle. But since their diet stays up, they now have a caloric surplus. That caloric surplus turns into body fat. So that's what ends up happening. So their muscle goes away as their belly grows. That's kind of what you're seeing. So as activity goes down, their food must go down. So I have worked with people in the past in various sports where in their off season they would have maybe a very highly active sport. Then in the off season they want to build muscle tissue and they want to build strength so the next in season they can do better, be more athletic, blah 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 blah. And what ends up happening is they'll often overeat during the off season and focus on heavy resistance training, but the heavy resistance training compared to all their aerobic activity is still less calories burned. And then here they are eating more, and they wonder why they get fat in the off season or why they get overweight in the off season, and then they have to condition the shit out of themselves to try to get back in shape for the season, which is just going to cost them the muscle that they tried to build in the off season. So often what happens in the off season is they get somewhat stronger, they get somewhat more muscle, but they get unnecessary fat amounts. Then, coming into the season, they say, oh shit, I'm fat and I'm out of shape. I'm just going to do a bunch of cardio. I'm going to stop doing as much of that muscle stuff and do more cardio. Then they wonder why their muscle goes away, their strength decreases, and they end up in the next season the same damn place they left off the last season. And that would be why. Okay? So that's the idea. If your activity goes down, your food must go down. Doesn't mean it has to a huge change. But if my activity goes down, say the representative of 300 calories a day, I would want my food to go down 300 calories a day. So that way I have enough calories for maintenance and to build some muscle tissue and have some strength development, but I don't have tons of excess to where I'm getting fat. Okay? So, now, what type of activity? You've heard me talk about it the whole time throughout here yet, is that it has to be resistance-based training, okay, stuff that promotes muscle building. If you do non-muscle involved cardio, so jogging, general running, like treadmill, elliptical, boring stuff like that, steady state, traditional cardio. What happens is it's just a one-to-one trade-off. For every calorie you're burning on the cardio machine, you get to eat one more calorie. Sure, okay? So that's kind of the idea. That's it. So if for every calorie I burn, I save 1 calorie in my diet. Or if I do muscle-involved stuff, I can get a 2-to-1 or even a 3-to-1 trade. So the smallest amount is a 2-to-1, where for every calorie I'm burning while I'm doing muscle involved, so muscle cardio, we have a past podcast about what muscle cardio is. Let me look that up real quick for you guys. So muscle cardio was podcast number 30. And what that refers to is using light to mediumly weighted activities as your cardio. So, for example, pushing and pulling a sled around, maybe flipping a tire, maybe hitting a tire with a sledgehammer. You might just do a light barbell circuit. So maybe I take like a light barbell. I might do bent over rows into overhead presses, into cleans, into back squats. And I just kind of do cycles of that, something like that. So there are even small circuits where you might take a weight plate, like a 10-pound bumper plate or a 25-pound bumper plate or even a 45-pound bumper plate. And you can do different activities like mimic squats and overhead presses. You can do a squat and twist to get your obliques and get the core. There's a whole bunch of crap you can do. So, but it's using resistance training as your cardio. What that does is for every calorie that you're burning in just like the way you're breathing, okay, your muscles are also burning calories because they're being used. They're using resources to keep up with the activity you're doing. Then, if you do enough of that and you meal time correctly to where you can get some surplus of protein after your workouts, you'll slowly build muscle tissue over time. Well, guess what? Muscle tissue requires calories to stay alive. We have to send nutrients to muscle tissue to keep it alive. So, I'm burning a calorie by being active. I'm burning a calorie because my muscles are also active too, not just my lungs. And for every extra bit of muscle I build, I get to burn another calorie because that muscle needs to be now fed in order to stay alive. So you can have a 2-to-1 or arguably a 3-to-1 trade-off of using muscle cardio compared to traditional cardio. So the other aspect is traditional cardio does zero, zip, zilch, zero to build muscle tissue. It actually promotes muscle tissue loss. So if you want to have that Greek god body, you want to have a butt, if you want to have arms, you want to have a chest, you want to have any muscle, you have to do things that build muscle, not tears it off the body. Okay? You have to do resistance training. You have to beat up the muscle that you have now and promote the body to build bigger ones. Okay? Stronger ones. So if you're just doing a diet and then basic cardio to lose fat, you will lose fat. You will also lose muscle. The number on the scale will go down, but you will look like shit. You'll feel like shit too. You're not going to look the way you want to look because you're not doing both parts of the equation. You have to lose fat and promote and build muscle. Okay? I'm trying to make this really obvious because this is a really important part, and you still see people screw this up all the time. So, I went on a diet, I've been dieting and I've been walking around the neighborhood. Whoop-de-frickin-do, that's half the problem. Like, that's half of it. Where's the other half? What the hell are you doing to build muscle? What the hell are you doing to maintain muscle? And don't tell me that you think you have so much muscle that you have some to lose. You can afford to lose some. Bullshit. Absolute bullshit. Okay? So if you're going to diet and do some cardio, you also need to do some muscle activity. You can either do muscle cardio and combine the two, or you can do muscle activity on top of the cardio activity you're also doing. Most people don't have the time for that, so they just combine the two. Okay? So that's the idea. Now, that's our goal. So how do we set up our food correctly? Is we have to look at three most important things. Number one is calories. So you can listen to podcast number 153, how many calories do I need? You also have to have enough protein at all times to prevent muscle being torn down as much as possible. And then also have protein after your resistance training type activities so you can actually promote the addition of new muscle tissue. So podcast number 33, titled How Much Protein Do I Need? You want to go listen to that. Meal timing, making sure you have surpluses when you need surpluses. Making sure you have deficits when you need deficits. So making sure you have maintenance when you need maintenance with your calories. That is podcast number 249. So podcast 249 will tell you what to do with meal timing. And, okay, little bonus podcast is number 245, titled Macronutrient Balance Based on Body Type. So typically what ends up happening is well, do I do a low-carb diet or do I do a low-fat diet? It doesn't really matter. As long as you control your calories and you have enough protein, it doesn't matter where the other calories come from. You can do 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, 80-20, 90-10, whatever the hell you feel like, of having fat versus carbs. Just whatever feels good to you, whatever floats your boat, whatever you feel good at, okay? So podcast 245 will talk about that. So, can you convert fat into muscle? No. Does muscle turn into fat? No. So now we know some of the science behind all this and how we can control these effects. So it does have the illusion of happening. But all the time what's happening is you're either gaining or losing fat while you're gaining or losing muscle. So we want to make sure we spend most of our time losing or keeping off body fat as we're trying to build muscle. Okay? So hopefully this gave you some good food for thought and gave you some kind of tidbits and some extra realizations of the importance of resistance training and how you can't just diet alone. So dieting alone and doing basic cardio is only half the equation. You're only going to get half the results. You're only going to be half as happy. Okay? So make sure you do all of the components. Cool. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful. If you like this information, you can find more from us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, Brutal Iron Gym. Also, if you like the podcast, please share it with family and friends. So the more people we help, the happier the world will be. And if you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. So the podcast is for you, so we love hearing what you want to learn about. Okay? And our email is brutalironGym@gmail.com. As always, I hope this was helpful. And thank you for listening.